The following takes place between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m.
It's Political Vindication Radio.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Who sees firsthand the concrete and mortar, the guard posts and machine gun towers, the dog runs and the barbed wire, can ever again take for granted his or her freedom or the precious gift that is America.
All this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, there's a lot of horse stuff. Americans love to fight. All real Americans love to stay in the battle.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Welcome to Political Vindication Radio, your guiding light through the Obama malaise years. This is PoliticalVindication.com on the air, and my name is Frank, also known as Uncle Seth the Noble.
And my name is Shane, also known as Ever Vigilant.
A special Saturday edition of Political Vindication Radio, as John Yoo, author of the torture memos and legal advisor to President George Bush in his administration's war on terror, will be our special guest in our first hour. We'll be discussing Professor Yoo's latest book, Crisis in Command, and why the Bush administration made the decisions it did in regards to the war on terror, his opinion of the Obama administration's approach to the war, and whether the lawyers leaving law school today are more liberal than ever before. Get ready as Professor Yoo of Berkeley joins us in just a few minutes.
Stirring up controversy again, this time back on campus over at California's Berkeley Law School. CNN's Dan Simon has the story for us. He's joining us live. What's going on, Dan?
Well, hi, Wolf. Well, today is the first day of classes here at Berkeley's Law School, and it has not been a very warm welcome for Professor John Yoo, who has been a critic, or has been a lightning rod for critics of the Bush administration. Take a look. As an attorney for the Justice Department in the George W. Bush administration, John Yoo wrote memos that justified the use of waterboarding terrorism suspects and the wiretapping of U.S. citizens. Now a law professor at Cal Berkeley, Yoo's presence is drawing scorn and protesters to the school, with some critics saying he has no business in the classroom and the university should sever the relationship. Stephanie Tang is an organizer with World Can't Wait, a group that advocates reversal of what it calls the fascist direction initiated by the Bush regime.
What is it that you're calling for?
We're calling for him to be fired from his position at the University of California, to be disbarred from the practice of law, and to be prosecuted for war crimes.
Yoo, like former Vice President Dick Cheney, has been outspoken in the defense of harsh interrogation.
Was it worth it? Well, we haven't had an attack in more than 7 years.
And in a recent opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal, Yoo writes, to limit the president's constitutional power to protect the nation from foreign threats is simply foolhardy. Protesters, including some Australian comedians, meanwhile, have tried to make Yoo look like a fool. This video, which has gone viral on the internet, has a comic infiltrating one of Yoo's lectures. The guy dons a costume reminiscent of the photos from Abu Ghraib.
Also, one question. How often are they required to attach torture?
And that's just what he did.
Sorry about this, people. It's so good to you. It's very uncomfortable for me, I can tell you.
Yoo has been teaching here at Berkeley's Law School on and off for about the last 15 years. He has the firm backing from the law school dean, not for his views, but for his rights to due process and academic freedom. We should also note that Professor Yoo's class this semester on civil procedure has a substantial waiting list.
Well, thank you for listening to Political Vindication Radio. My name is Shane. I'm here with my good friend Frank. We're usually on Tuesdays. We're on from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time every Tuesday, talking about politics and history and culture, past and present, and the future. But today's a very special day, and we are proud and humbled to have a man such as John Yoo joining us. He's widely known as a Bush administration Justice Department lawyer, had a lot to do with influencing anti-terror policy after this country was attacked on 9/11. He's reviled by so many who've never taken the time to read his trilogy of books explaining in great detail the opinions he gave to the president. Those books, The Powers of War and Peace, War by Other Means was the second one, and recently, Crisis and Command. And so, Mr. Yu, Professor Yu, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Excellent. After a presidential campaign that focused on our conduct in the war on terror, subsequent year of Barack Obama, for the most part, slamming that, then continuing with the policies he railed against, I've got to agree with our president that your work has proven integral in defending his powers as Commander-in-Chief to wage war and keep Americans safe. And so I don't think we'll be getting a call from him, the president, today to thank you for that. So I'll gladly stand in, offer a nation's gratitude to you, sir, for that. Every day your service is vindicated with the fact that this nation remains safe. So thank you, Mr. Yu.
Oh, well,
so much.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. Thank you.
Let's get straight to your book and kind of go through a few steps. I have to say, this is the kind of education that a lot of us out here, average Americans, work during the day and come home and read at night, really treasure here. And you spend a good portion at the beginning of your book, Crisis and Command. Folks, you can find a link to that book right above the page on our radio page. You can go to Political Vindication as well, too. You spend a good portion at the beginning of your book talking about setting up the environment that the administration was working in that made it necessary for you and Judge Jay Bybee to confront some of these tricky legal constitutional conundrums, okay, in this newly launched war on terror. And I want to go through a couple of those here, even though I'm sure you've answered these questions 1,000 times, sir.
Oh, good. Very good.
September 11th, 2001, we're attacked. Bush administration goes into Afghanistan to go after terrorists harboring Taliban. We ultimately invade Iraq as well to try to root out conspiring terrorists in that country here. We didn't declare war in either scenario, and that's become a popular argument for delegitimizing all the decisions related to the war on terror, right? The administration opts for an authorization for military force instead, and we watch since then congressional opponents and people run up for president here, create various excuses, Professor, as to why they gave them that authority and why they wouldn't do it now. So tell us, why didn't we just declare war on somebody and make it all constitutionally legit? And would it have made any difference if we had in our fight against terrorism?
Well, there's this myth, I think, that's sort of developed by people who oppose just war of any kind, which is this idea that Congress has to issue an actual declaration of war before the president can wage it. And I just, as I explained in Crisis and Command, that's just not what the framers set up when they set up the presidency and gave it the commander-in-chief power and the power over to the chief executive to protect the country. We've had 5 declared wars in our history, but we've had 130 military conflicts abroad. No, our framers and people in the government ever since have never assumed that Congress has to declare war whenever the president has to use force. And you can just, it's easy to understand when you just look at the 9/11 attacks themselves. The country was attacked on 9/11. Suppose that President Bush either knew the attacks were coming and could have stopped them, or could have attacked Afghanistan immediately to catch Osama bin Laden. Would it have made any sense for our Constitution to require Congress to meet and issue a declaration of war before the president could take immediate military action to protect the country or to pursue its enemies? The Constitution, as famously been said, is not a suicide pact. It shouldn't be read to prevent the government from protecting Americans.
Professor Yu, this is Frank. I want to welcome you to Political Vindication Radio. That's an interesting question, because I think one of what the left would argue is that, well, what you've argued is that the Constitution basically gives the President of the United States, the executive branch, a very vague powers where he is allowed to maneuver. And I think what the left would charge is, but where is that line? Where is the check on the presidency so he doesn't become sort of a dictatorial institution? Is the Congress, the Supreme Court, who is there to check that power, and where is that line of authority when it's crossed by the executive branch?
It's a good question. Let me say first, despite all of these worries that the left always have about dictators or tyranny, we've never had one in our country. We've never had that problem. It's always this sort of mythic beast that's going to come and take over America. But our system has worked, and our system has had periods where we've had even greater threats to the country, even broader uses of presidential power than we've seen in the last decades, and our system has always made sure that we didn't have any problems where the executive branch waged some kind of dictatorial authority. And here's why: because the Constitution sets up a self-regulating system where each of the branches has its own set of constitutional powers. And here in this case, if the president does go too far in exercising his powers, Congress can always check him, even during wartime. So, for example, the Vietnam War, famously ended because Congress passed a ban on the use of any money for continuing the fighting in Southeast Asia. Congress has full control over the size and shape of the military and how it's funded, to the extent where no president can really wage any war unless Congress implicitly cooperates by funding that war, even if there's a declaration or not. All Congress has to do to stop a war is just not to give the president any money for it.
Right. Well, in your legal opinion, have we ever had a president that has come close to crossing the line? And who would that be in history, looking back at history?
Yeah. I mean, one of the points, the basic point of crisis and command, what I was trying to show is that we have had periods of our history where presidents have waged enormous powers, and in the end, in most of those cases, we were actually lucky as a country that we had presidents who had foresight to step up and use those powers to protect the country. I think the most striking historical example, the president who used the greatest powers of his office would be Abraham Lincoln, who really is the hero of the book, the central chapter of the book. If you look at Lincoln, he, at the start of the Civil War, interpreted the powers of his office to give him the authority to stop secession. And it's an interesting, we accept that the president today could do that, but at that time that was a very controversial position. The previous president, right before him, James Buchanan, who most scholars think is the worst president in our history, Buchanan actually thought that as president he couldn't actually stop the South from leaving the Union. He just thought the president had no power to do it. Lincoln, as we know from history, took extraordinary measures at the beginning of the Civil War. He raised an Army and Navy. He took money out of the Treasury to pay it. He sent the Army and Navy into offensive operations against the South. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He refused to obey an order from the Chief Justice of the United States to release suspected Confederate spies. And I think his greatest act as president, the one we honor him for the most, in addition to saving the Union, was an act of unilateral presidential power, which was the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Freeing the slaves was an act solely by Lincoln, taken under his commander-in-chief power to hurt the South in its military effort, and it was at odds with the constitutional law of its day. The law of the day was still Dred Scott, which said that the federal government and the state government could not prevent slavery.
I really appreciate how you explain that. For all of our founders' misgivings about executive power, the Constitution they adopted leaves the power of the office really an open question. For a nation that rebelled against the notion of a king, and in fact created an Article of Confederation that kind of symbolized that, reflected that, why in the Constitution did they leave so much of the executive branch's power up to the executive?
That's a good question. And one thing I tried to show is that you're quite right. The revolutionaries in the framing generation, of course, rebelled against England in part because of their suspicion of King George III and monarchical power. But in the years after the revolution, the country actually suffered very badly because it had no executive. As you mentioned, the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation actually did not have an executive branch. It was just a giant legislature. And then in the states, the state governments had very weak governors. And this was seen as a big fault that needed to be corrected by men like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the people who were responsible for the Constitution that we have today. And so they had a lot of foresight. They'd studied a lot of other governments and constitutions, and their view was that you needed to have an executive branch because you always need to have some part of the government that could respond, in their words, quickly, with speed and decision, and sometimes secrecy, to respond to emergencies and unforeseen crises and even war. If you could anticipate everything, and if legislatures could act quickly, then maybe a giant Congress could take care of everything. But they realized, and I think they were very wise about this, they realized that without an executive branch, the government could not defend the country's security. On the other hand, the implication is when in times of relative peace or in matters of domestic affairs that don't involve national security, you don't need the presidency. The presidency is not supposed to play this gigantic role. It's supposed to be, and this is the framers were very clear about this, they thought the presidency would actually serve as a check on Congress going too far. I'm not making any obvious comparisons to today.
So let's continue that real quickly. A president needs the ability to act swiftly in times of crisis. On page 403 of Crisis at Command, we're talking to Professor John Yoo here on Political Vindication Radio. On page 403, you write about bureaucratic inertia that's inherent in a government run by career bureaucrats, and I just love that story. I mean, we often heard about that during the Bush administration, where you had the CIA or the State Department kind of pushing back against the Bush administration's orders here. You're right that it's difficult. In fact, it takes a kind of a special kind of president to overcome the intransigence of government departments. Really, in a way, that's kind of a check on the executive's power to make any kind of radical change or movement in one direction or another, isn't it, Professor?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because one thing is, in terms of the great presidents like Washington and Lincoln and FDR, who I also discuss in the book, and mostly about his actions leading up to World War II, when they take these steps, when they go forward and claim broad powers to meet these challenges, they always meet enormous resistance, political and bureaucratic. The bureaucracy, of course, likes things the way they are. The bureaucracy resists change. And the bureaucracy, and I say this unfortunately because this is one of the factors that contributed to the 9/11 attacks, the bureaucracy is risk-averse. The bureaucracies are not aggressive. And, the more we learned about what caused the 9/11 attacks, it's caused by radical Islamists from abroad, but the reason they succeeded, in part, was because our bureaucracy was so risk-averse and meek. But they will fight presidents who demand big change in order to respond to national security threats. It happens every time. Just to give you some examples, Lincoln is a great example. Remember who Lincoln's opponent was in the 1864 presidential elections. It was his former general-in-chief, General McClellan, who called Lincoln a dictator, but he also called him incompetent. It's a strange claim to call someone an incompetent dictator, I suppose.
Man, deja vu.
Yes, so if you think about Lincoln was the person who ran against him in the 1864 election was the head of the bureaucracy at the time. The Army was the largest bureaucracy in our country during the Civil War, and so presidents always face this kind of resistance. Which shows that's another. It goes back to Frank's first question. That's also another check on the president, as you say, too.
Yeah.
Because the Congress is a check, the bureaucracy is a check. So it's a way of making sure that when presidents have to act this way, that it really is the appropriate time, and it's not a president who's just trying to seize power.
So let me ask you about one other thing that riles the left. You write about applying the Geneva Convention to terrorists, that it was rejected by President Bush. And in fact, I remember you talking somewhat about them wanting to amend the Geneva Constitution, I think, in the 70s to have it cover that, and Reagan rejected that.
Yeah.
But by doing so, a lot of people say that delegitimizes America's standing in the world, and and things like this. And in fact, in your interview with Jon Stewart, it was one of those things you didn't get into, but in many ways it lays at the base of his disagreement with you and with the Bush administration. So why didn't we apply that convention?
Well, the most important reason is because al-Qaeda terrorists are not parties to the Geneva Conventions either. They're not a member. They're not a treaty. They don't belong to the treaty. They're not a state. But most importantly, they don't obey any of the civilized rules of warfare. The Geneva Conventions are designed to be an agreement amongst countries to obey certain rules, and the primary purpose of those rules is to limit fighting on the effect of fighting, the harm of fighting to civilians. That's really the great advancement of the rules of war and the Geneva Conventions, is to try to keep innocent civilians out of the fighting. And if you think about how al-Qaeda operates, if you look at 9/11, the al-Qaeda operates by trying to overcome that principle, by blurring the lines, right? So their attack on 9/11 was against, the ones in New York were against purely civilian targets with no military value. They disguised themselves as civilians. They hijacked civilian airliners and used them as weapons. If you think about it, the reason al-Qaeda succeeds at all is because they're not willing to fight by the civilized rules of warfare. So my view is that the law doesn't require them to get any of the protections that we would give to honorable people, honorable warriors, who make a clear distinction between civilians and combatants. And in fact, we're never going to get anybody to follow the rules of war if we're going to give everybody the best protections, no matter how they act and no matter what they do.
Reagan, and that was Reagan's rationale behind that?
Yes,
yeah.
Reagan, yes, that's quite right. Reagan, many of the countries of the world in the 1970s signed on to this treaty to amend the Geneva Conventions to give protections to guerrillas and terrorists of the same kind that our soldiers get when they follow all these rules. And the Reagan administration, I think quite rightly said, we're not going to sign this because you are encouraging these kinds of people to act the way they do, to attack civilians, to invite attacks on civilians, to refuse to obey the rules of warfare. And so the Reagan administration quite clearly said, we're not going to give these protections to terrorists. They don't deserve them. I think it was a very wise decision by President Reagan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Professor, you, of course, are very well known as being one of the primary authors of the torture memos that we've heard so much about in the media and in the press. Just kind of, reflecting back, looking at the war on terror, how we're dealing with it today, what do you think your legacy is going to be looking back in history when it comes to how we deal with the war on terror?
Well, let me say first off, that's we didn't think about it in those terms at the time. Back on in the day, I was at the Justice Department on 9/11. I was one of the people who was not allowed to evacuate from the city. I had to stay behind and start immediately working on these matters. And I'll never forget that day. I did eventually go home very late at night or early in the morning, as it were, and I still remember my route home back then used to take me by the Pentagon, and I saw that day I saw that Pentagon on fire. I thought, wow, I'd never see in my lifetime. Never even occurred to me that would ever happen. So, when think about it from that perspective, my thought was, what can lawyers do to contribute to help protect the country? And I didn't think about anything about historical legacies or permanent changes to the legal system. What I wanted to do was to help figure out a way to make sure that the law allowed, our men and women who were going to have to fight this war to have all the tools they needed. And the things we discovered, I'm afraid, in the days and weeks after 9/11 was that, unfortunately, lawyers in the law had actually contributed to the success of the 9/11 attacks by handcuffing the ability of our intelligence agents to really go after al-Qaeda. I'll just give you one example of that. There was a law called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which prohibited wiretapping without a warrant for national security purposes inside the country. because of the Justice Department and courts, that law was read to prevent the CIA and FBI from sharing intelligence information. And because of that, the CIA actually had the picture. Before 9/11, the CIA actually had the identities and pictures of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. Before they knew they were in the country. It's all in the 9/11 Commission report. And the lawyers read the law at that time to prohibit the CIA from telling the FBI that they were here and to try to catch them. I says, so after the 9/11 attacks, I wanted to make sure, that we operate within the Constitution, but that, barriers like that, which make no sense, should be changed so that our FBI, our CIA agents could really go after Al-Qaeda with the full, with full powers that the law allows.
We're talking with Professor Yu here, and the author of Crisis in Command. I was going to read to you, Professor, some torrid abuse from some liberal person slamming you for one reason or another, but I realized you work at Berkeley, so you hear enough of that here.
That's professional. That's something that's really different.
Yeah. So, but your latest Wall Street Journal column, man, it seemed to me like a rhetorical exhale after years of enduring this kind of abuse, complete with an investigation by the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, which finally concluded that, having a different opinion isn't illegal.
Right.
In America. It's still allowed in America, though you still face protests today. I know in a month you're going to be in Virginia, and they're getting all geared up for you over there, too. I mean, after all you've been through, could you give me an idea of what you think of your opponent's arguments? I mean, are they valid? Are they just so much malice? Is it a symptom of Bush derangement syndrome? How serious do you take that now after having answered these kind of questions thousands of times?
Yeah, I have to tell you, the investigation, I think, was ridiculous. As you say, the effort to use criminal laws and ethics rules to fight over what are just legitimate policy differences, I think that really is destructive and is an effort to return us back to the way things were before September 11th in terms of what our government can do. But I also think that many of the arguments that were used by these investigators and the sort of left-wing blogs and crowd that support them just would strike many Americans as ludicrous. So I'll just give you one example. I just sort of briefly alluded to it in that Wall Street Journal piece. One of the things we analyzed in our work was whether a member of a government agent could claim self-defense if they were ever prosecuted for going too far with an Al-Qaeda leader. You could say, look, I thought there was an imminent attack and I didn't want to do this, but I did it because I was trying to defend myself and my fellow citizens and the country. So we said, this person might be able to raise a defense that he was acting in his own self-defense. It would depend on the facts, the circumstances. The investigators at the Justice Department said, in this Office of Professional Responsibility, claimed over and over again that no American has a right to claim self-defense against a prosecution by the government. And I was just thunderstruck. The idea that if you or I were attacked by somebody and we killed them in our self-defense, that we couldn't defend ourselves in court by saying we were trying to save our own lives and the lives of our fellow citizens. And I also said, what do you think the Second Amendment is in the Constitution for? Does that mean we can all walk around with guns, but we can never fire them if someone were to attack us? I just this was the most remarkable outside, mainstream extreme claims.
Well, talk about tortured logic. I want to ask you about a few things that are going on today. And I know in all three of your books, you kind of allude to these kind of distortions that are going on right now, the very pitfalls of the approach. Drones. Now, the left is outraged about it going after the loathsome Saddam Hussein and jailing so many jihadis at Guantanamo. But this administration's been using drones to really summarily execute anyone that makes that mysterious list comprised of extremists who endanger Obama's domestic agenda. How is that legal? Doesn't our prohibition against assassinating foreign nationals make these drone attacks somewhat suspect? I mean, what's happening there? Professor?
Well, first let me say I think it does show that a lot of the attacks on the last administration for depriving terrorists of their civil liberties is completely partisan and not really principled, because why haven't all these groups and lawyers been suing the Obama administration for doing something which is far worse than not letting a terrorist have a lawyer, which is just to kill them with a missile? And that strikes me as a much bigger deprivation of civil liberties. But I think that that the policy is legal, but I think it's not a great policy, because I think it's legal because if we are at war with Al-Qaeda, then we have the right to attack any member of Al-Qaeda, just the way we have the right to, shoot and try to kill any member of an enemy military in uniform, no matter where they are, whether they're behind the scene or behind the front lines, or on the front lines. But I don't think it's a great idea, but it's a natural result of the Obama administration's unwillingness to use tough interrogation methods. They don't want to capture people anymore, right? So it's much easier just to shoot them with missiles. But it's actually worse for our ability to fight Al-Qaeda, because since the enemy are just a network, and since they have no territory, capital city, population, regular armed forces, the only way we're really going to stop them is by gathering intelligence and acting on it quickly. And you think about it, when we use a missile to kill somebody, maybe, top Al-Qaeda leaders, if we could have captured them and gotten more information about the plans and their network, that would be much more successful for our ability to carry the fight to Al-Qaeda than just killing them, because they're kind of like weeds. You can kill them, but they're someone's going to step up and take their place. The better thing would be to get the information that's in their heads, and that we're losing out on because of the sort of redoubling, or even more so, of the use of the drone programs.
Yeah. Which brings us, of course, now to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in New York, or supposedly was supposed to be tried in New York. Professor, what is the purpose of the administration pursuing trials in civilian courts? Do you believe the lawyers believe in the notion that this is where it legally belongs when you catch an enemy combatant, or do you think simply the administration is on the hook for fulfilling a campaign promise as part of bashing the previous administration? And your general thoughts on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, if that is put in civilian courts, what's that going to mean for the future of fighting the war on terror?
Well, it's a good question. I really think it shows how this current administration just has sort of a civil libertarian view of the world. It's our ACLU vision of things, just hardwired into its DNA, because they just can't consider the cost to the national security of doing something like this. Obviously, if we could, everyone would like to try the terrorists in civilian court, but their harms to our security are enormous. And let me try to explain them. One is, once you are going to try people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you have to give them their Miranda warnings, you have to give them a lawyer, which means that any information you're going to get from them is going to stop, because the first thing you're going to do is stop talking. So you dry up the most immediate source of information, which is our best weapon in this war. And then the second thing you do is you actually force our government to have to put out in public our intelligence, because the one constitutional right that every criminal defendant who appears in federal court has is the right to say, I think the government has to put out in open court all the information it has on me to help me in my defense. That makes perfect sense when you have a garden variety criminal, but when you have a terrorist in the middle of an ongoing war, that means he's going to be able to force us to put information out there about how we found out about him, what we know about him, how we knew where he was, how we collected intelligence on him. And think about it, it's an intelligence bonanza for Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. Then the worst thing of all, actually, in my view, it doesn't even have to do with whether we eventually convict him or how much it's going to cost to secure the trial in New York City. The worst thing of all is that it's going to create limitations on how our men and women in the field are going to have to operate in the future. Because if there's some chance that some Al-Qaeda leader that you capture is going to be tried in civilian court and not held by the military, then our soldiers, our agents in the field are going to have to start acting like police officers. They're going to have to start reading people Miranda warnings on the battlefield. They're going to have to start giving them lawyers quickly. They're going to have to collect evidence. Can you believe this? Collect evidence in the battlefield environment and make sure it's secured and brought back all the way eventually to New York City and places like that. It's really going to interfere with the ability of our soldiers and intelligence agents to actually do the job they're there to do.
Amazing, amazing. One more question for you, Professor, and we do appreciate your time today. Thanks to Senator Grassley, we're learning more about the attorneys peopling the Justice Department today. There's several that represented potential jihadis in Guantanamo, several more from law firms that devote a lot of hours to undermining the policies of the Bush administration. Is this an issue we ought to be concerned about? Because you're reading more about it on National Review. You're reading a lot of people starting to write about it. Is this a conflict of interest? Are you concerned about it? Is it something we ought to be concerned about?
Oh, yes, certainly, because, and here's a good example of the bad effects this might be having, is the Christmas Day bomber in Detroit. And as we're learning now, the Holder Justice Department just automatically assumed that this guy, Omar Abdul Talib, was going to be a criminal defendant. They didn't even consider the idea that he might be an enemy combatant. They didn't consider not reading him his Miranda warnings and giving him a lawyer. Right? Who knows what kind of information he might have had. And maybe we were lucky in this regard. Suppose he had been part of a 9/11 style attack where there were multiple operatives on multiple airplanes. If we read him his Miranda warnings, where it's been weeks and weeks until he started talking, we wouldn't have been able to crack any kind of bigger plot. And maybe there have been things we missed on, because the minute that arrest is announced on TV, you can be sure that all the training camps and places where safe houses where the Detroit bomber had been were immediately rolled up, and anybody he met has been moved, and plots he might have known about have been ended. Right? The problem with having, I think, attorneys who were so hard over against the Bush administration's terrorism policies is that they just reflexively and automatically think everything with terrorism is a law enforcement problem. And as we're learning that, as in the case of the Detroit City bomber, that's going to have real cost to our security and our ability to fight this war if they're unwilling to think of it as a war.
It's really interesting that our founders believed that the judicial branch would be the most conservative branch.
Yeah,
and in many ways,
they did not think that the courts would ever get involved, I think, in things like this until the war was over. And this administration actually wants the courts to become more involved.
Yeah, but they are taking an affirmative action into getting involved in things, and they are changing. I'm trying to come to words with the professor. The idea that there's a cabal is too big of a word. There's a move by the legal left to influence the direction of our country not through legislation or through his ways, but through the law.
Oh, yeah, I quite agree. Through the courts. I mean, this is going on in lots of other areas, too, for schools, religion, abortion, affirmative action. I mean, the left in the country critically depends on the courts because they can't win in Congress and the legislature. So they try to accelerate their program by convincing judges to do it. And that's been nowhere more clear than on terrorism, because under the traditional constitutional rules that we have used in wartime, and I tried to explain in Crisis and Command, the system gives the president the primary say in how to fight wars. And what the left have tried to do, I think pretty successfully, I mean, I'm amazed they've had so much success, is they've gone to court and tried to challenge almost every single aspect of the war on terrorism, trying to say that's really just a criminal problem. And sometimes, unfortunately, some of the judges in the country and some of the justices on the Supreme Court have agreed with them.
Yeah, Professor, one more question here concerning the legality and the power of the courts. When I was in college, the landmark legal case that was most cited to justify the ever-encroaching power of the courts was Marbury versus Madison. Would you agree with the argument that that case was one that launched the power of the courts and maybe in some respects gave powers that the founders may have not intended for the courts?
Well, I don't think it was Marbury itself. Marbury is the case that said the court can exercise the power of judicial review, the power to declare a statute as unconstitutional. But I think what's happened is, and I actually talk quite a bit about this in Crisis and Command, is that the Supreme Court was very modest about this for a long time. It used the power sparingly because it understood that the President and Congress had an equal right to interpret the Constitution. And our greatest presidents, the ones I was talking about before, like Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Jackson, all believed that the President could interpret the Constitution at odds or variance with the Supreme Court. And what happened was, over time, and particularly in the last 20, 30 years, the courts have taken what was supposed to be a fairly narrow power and have tried to claim supremacy over the interpretation of the Constitution and have, I think, really stepped beyond their proper constitutional role. And you're starting to see, and you are seeing that in terrorism just as much as you see it on cases like abortion or religion, race, and so on.
As a law professor, you're seeing the future of the legal profession in your classrooms every day. Are you optimistic for the future?
Yes, I am. I actually tend to think that the current students in this generation are much more pragmatic and less ideologically left than most of their teachers. So that gives me hope for the future.
Awesome. We've been talking to John Yoo. We appreciate you so much again, sir. You have not only made the arguments, but you've come out and defended them. And to me, that's heroic. We can only imagine what it is that you go through constantly for that, but we do appreciate it that you're coming out and you're defending a lot of positions as us average folks out here, try to spread that message as well, but not nearly as eloquent as you. Thank you, Professor, for coming on.
Oh, thank you very much for having me anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
That is Professor John Yoo. Again, my friends, read his books. It is an excellent education, and it puts in context a lot of what you're hearing argued in the media today. You can hear from the left, and they're upset about this and that here too, but I'm telling you what, The Powers of War and Peace, War by Other Means, Crisis and Command, a trilogy of books that puts you right in the room, and not only do you get a sense of where the Bush administration was and this unique attack on America by a stateless, amorphous, terrorist group that could live among us and then attack the country, and how you deal with that, but also historically how we've dealt with those kind of conundrums before, and in many cases having to deal for the first time with something utterly and terribly unique, Frank.
Yeah, and we should support John Yoo and buy his book simply because he's a conservative that teaches up in Berkeley. I mean, the man just deserves respect, for crying out loud. No, but it was just a wealth of knowledge, my friend. Definitely a constitutional lawyer. As we try to answer a lot of the questions in sort of this modern day war that we're fighting. This war, Shane, is unlike any other war that we fought in our history. World War I, World War II, the battle lines were drawn. They were evil, we were the good guys, and I'm sure they viewed us the same way. But in the end, the sort of the legal ramification, the legal terminology of what this war is, how it's being fought, that has all been redefined, and we need more of the John Yoo types that defend the position, that will go out of their way to defend America first and foremost. And that's why I respect this man, and it was an honor to talk to him, my friend.
Well, and he reminds us, too, that it is very much a battle of intelligence. This isn't armies on a field of strategy. Yeah. We're going to talk about overall tactics, about how we take on our enemies on a field of battle. We're talking about intelligence. That's what we're trying to get to. So when you hear about the Obama administration who approaches this situation in a way that says, well, when we learn about somebody being in a high position in Al-Qaeda or in the Afghani Taliban, we're going to send a drone out there and we're going to kill them. Okay, I understand that with Barack Obama. I understand that with Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri and people like this. Those are the heads of the snake, of the Hydra, and we want to cut them off. We want to bring those guys down, too, because it led to a certain amount of confusion. Though I would agree with McCarthy and Mark Thiessen and these guys that say this is a multi-headed, multi-legged, multifaceted movement, extremist Islamic movement that means to hit us in many spaces at one time. And one of the great fears I have, Frank, and I've repeated this over and over again, I am not so worried about a grand attack by terrorists that kills thousands of people in America. I do worry about that, but that is not something that I concern myself with as much as the specter of having several attacks consecutively on this country that lends our population here in America to be so discombobulated that they turn to their government willing to trade in our rights for promises of freedom, trade in our security, Frank, trade in our freedoms for security, which just cannot be. Can you imagine if we started having a whole bunch of attacks all over the place that I think really, and I thought this country reacted very well during 9/11, Frank, but if this country had a whole bunch of attacks going on, that we would end up turning on each other, and we would essentially demand that the government put chains on us. See, that's what I'm afraid of, folks.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important. When we talk about the Patriot Act, Frank, we talk about these certain things here. People say, you're going too far, you're going too far. Imagine the consequences if we have a situation in America that becomes so unstable and so wrought with fear that Americans themselves cast away their fear of big government and say, protect us. Man, now that's scary, Frank. Really.
Yeah. Well, what you remind me, Shane, is World War II, how we had internment camps in this country for people of Japanese and Italian and I believe German descent as well. And so would America ever go that far again? I think with the political correctness crowd, I think that makes it a little bit more complicated for any administration to get away with it, especially Republican administrations. I just think, as we've talked about earlier today with the drone killing, Democratic Party administrations could get away with a lot more because of political correctness. But I think you're right. I think as we move forward, we have to consider what all the legal channels are, and we have to educate ourselves, and how we act is just as important. You said it so many times on this show, Shane. After 9/11, it was, to me, what was most amazing was how America was now rounding up people of Middle East descent and throwing them in jail or throwing them in concentration camps. America were very tamed and very controlled. They were scared, but very controlled on how they reacted to the war on terror. And to me, that is something I've always been impressed with, sort of with the American persona since 9/11. And I think we're good people, Shane. And I think if the multiple attacks like you fear were to come true, I think we would deal with it in a very similar fashion, my friend.
Hey, we're a good and decent country, Frank. Absolutely. We always have been. And we're doing it again here, willing to put American lives on the line so that we don't offend everybody. I agree with Victor Davis Hanson saying the same thing, absolutely. Here, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We're going to talk about the last week, talk about the summit, talk about CPAC. We'd love to talk to you as well. Political Vindication Radio.
Old people got no reason. Old people got no reason. Old people got no reason to live. They need lots of drugs, new hips. After falling down just a couple of steps, they need pacemakers. The cost is out of sight. I'd give them a pain pill and just say goodbye. We got no hips for old people. Too many old people. We'll just give old people some pills. We need to watch our costs, and they're unproductive.
Old people are just the same as you and I.
Their cost is sky high.
All men are brothers,
but it's time they die. It's a wonderful plan. Fat people got big bodies. Fat people got big bodies. Fat people got big bodies and bad luck. They don't exercise. They move too slow. They got heart disease and cholesterol. They'll need those expensive machines that go beep, beep, beep. hospital tests that don't come cheap. I'm gonna tax every single thing they eat, every greasy bag of chips, every single treat, 'cause I know that people can't help all those people. We're gonna ration their health care. But don't worry, because if you're on the federal plan, you're not going to be forced into anything like what I'm going to give those people, because you're valuable. And I'm also part of that plan.